Hello there, this is Douglas Robinson with Trebuchet Software, and in this video we're going to talk about building fancy tables, or what I would call fancy tables, within emails as well as displaying them within pop-ups in Cherwell. Now, I recently made a post on LinkedIn about this report here that I have on my screen, and this is something that I've been working on as part of a map that we're building in which we'll be able to have customers download a map and configure it to send out different teams reports about how many open tickets they have for each team, and each team can go and subscribe, and it ends up coming through that email in a very useful, pretty format like this, so that you don't have to open an attachment. And the reason this is important is that you couldn't typically do this before. So our map will actually have a field where teams can be subscribed to or unsubscribed. But the important part was that you couldn't typically embed the contents of a table like this into an email. Like you can attach a report, you could build a formal report within Cherwell, save it out to a disk and attach it, but that only works so well and people don't really like opening up an attachment. But I have personally struggled, as well as I know a lot of other administrators have struggled to get something similar to this because so many other tools can do this. And so in this video, we're going to go over how we can actually build out something like this within an email in Cherwell. And the quick answer, the simple answer is we're going to build it out using HTML. And so let me pull up my business object and we can walk through exactly what we were doing for that. For some reason, oh, right. I don't have it as a lookup table. I have a dashboard. So we basically construct out this table in HTML using a one-step, and then we save it to the disk, and then we pull it back from the disk, and we display that within the body of an email. So we have a business object here for Trebuchet Report Manager. It's just a dummy business object. It's got some settings like how often we should send out this email and when, and there's an automation process that triggers off of that. But the meat of this functionality will be inside this step through children action here. When you build this out, you don't need this step through children. This is just something we're doing so that for each team that's subscribed, we'll send out that email. So in essence, what you'll need are these steps here, excluding this pop-up here. So what we're doing is we're building out a table within HTML. And I can go ahead and pop this out, zoom it in a bit so we can see what's going on here. I may have lied. I thought I could zoom in, but maybe I can't. Well, that's fine. I also have this open in Adobe Brackets, which is also not letting me zoom in. There we go. So the first half here that's in that first action is going to consist of this. This is going to have an HTML tag. It's going to have some CSS styling embedded within a style tag. This is going to give us our cell borders because otherwise it'll format a table and it will not put borders around it, so you'll just have spacing between each of your columns. I personally like this look where we've got borders around each of our cells. So we've added CSS styling for that, as well as a style for the background color, which is light blue. And you'll see that for this header here, by default, this background would be white, and we want the header to stand out a bit. So we're accomplishing that with CSS as well. Keep hitting the wrong buttons. I tried to make the color white, but I believe since we're pasting this into the body of an email, it's not picking up that CSS tag because when we paste it in there, there's font changes that Cherwell applies to the tokens you put in there. We'll talk about that more later. So we had CSS input here for the font size and the color, but those weren't actually getting picked up. And then we have the body. Now this is, I should iterate again if you're not very familiar with it. What we're doing is we're building out an actual HTML document as if this were a web page. And then we've used a trick to pull that into our email within Cherwell. So every HTML page generally has a body, and this is where the actual content that you're going to see is. The rest of this CSS is just for displaying how different elements will display. And in the body, we have a table element. So that's where all of our data is actually going to show up and get arranged. We've put in a style here for a border around the table itself. And then something really important, other people have tried this in a number of different ways. And what they've come across, if they put borders around it, is that they get an email where there's actual gaps around each of the borders and it doesn't look very user friendly. We've also put in a tag on our table element called cell spacing. This will get rid of the gaps. I don't know if I have an example available that I can show you, but that part is actually important if you put borders around it. And then the rest of this HTML document will just be setting up the table headers. You need one of these for each column. You can put in the actual text values in between the start and end tags here for what they should show up, like short description, owner, incident ID, date created. And then I'm also specifying the widths for each of these for how wide they should be. And then that is the very first action in our one step. So I'm going to pause and move on. You can see all that information is right there. What we're doing next, we're using a step through children action to loop through every incident that a team owns. And inside that step through children action, we're populating the table row elements. So this is going to be a TR element right here. And that's going to have a series of TD elements. So you can see that more clearly here where I have it blown up. These HTML tags, TR means table row, and then you'll see there's, I think, 4 different TD tags, and these are table data. You put these in the order of your table headers, and it'll automatically map them to the different columns. So all we're doing is saying, here's a row, here's a value of a date, incident ID, the owner, the description, and we just run through every single open ticket and do that. Then at the end of this, our next one-step action is going to be to close off this HTML table. So you can see what I'm doing with that here. We're populating a variable of incident list with itself and then a table row with different table data columns for each of these values. The next action, we close off that HTML table using a variable. So it's going to insert the first value from HTML table from this earlier action, and it's appending on the incident list variable that we just built out using our step through children action. And then we're appending the ending table tag in HTML, the ending body tag in HTML, and the ending HTML document tag. Now we have this entire document inside an HTML document, and the next steps are going to be getting it to render and then getting it within the body of an email or a pop-up, because we can put this in both of those places as a rendered table and it'll look very nice. I personally would recommend, if you're playing with this more or less and making changes and testing how different CSS styles or other things will look, you can use a tool called Adobe Brackets. There's a lot of different HTML editors out there, but I like Brackets because it has a fancy little button here, and you can actually have a live preview within Google Chrome where you can make changes in real time. So for example, I had CSS for the color of these columns to be white and the font size to be 18, and I can see what that would have looked like if it actually rendered. If I take those out in real time, I can see what that does to my table. That's a bad example because Cherwell is not going to let you change the color of the text here, just the color of the backgrounds. But if I wanted to, for example, add on or change the name of one of these columns, and just say, instead of date created, created date time, you can see that it's changing those values off on the left in real time. So I like Brackets for that. You can make a lot of real-time edits, and you don't have to keep launching and testing and trial and erroring things. You can just see exactly what's going on in real time. So once you have what you want for the HTML here, you can paste it into your document, or you can paste it into your variables here in your one-step action. And the next step is going to be writing it to a file. So you'll notice I've got a write to file action, and my file name is a token here. This is a file name token. Now you might have seen this before. The use for it is this right here. If you're going to write to a file, you don't know necessarily on your server which directories you have access to. Well, the file name token, if you select new file name, gives you the option to specify a file in the temp directory on the server or on the workstation, wherever it's run. It will create a file path on the temp directory, as long as you say file name includes a full path. And that allows you to make sure that you always have a valid path to save a file, and it removes the issue of having to figure out where you have access to create a file. So I am creating a file name token there called HTML file. It does get deleted after the one step is complete, and that's all for that. And we're saving in the contents of our HTML table variable. Now the next part's very important. At the bottom of this, you want to set format to plain text. I think by default it saves it in either rich text or HTML, and you don't want that. Even though this is HTML content, you want it saved exactly as is. So you'll have to pick plain text, and then you want to make sure you pick that it's make sure file is written before next sub step. Otherwise, it might not get written exactly at the time that you need it. The next step is we have something called a read file content or read from file token. Now this is where we're going to get the magic of our HTML rendering. So if you select new file, you can see what this dialog looks like originally. You have a name field where you can name this token. So I've named it HTML output, and then you've got a file name. Now for this, you can just punch in the exact file name that you created earlier, which is a temp file, and then you're going to select for format HTML format, and you mark these two reload buttons in case it changes, so it doesn't cache. And this is what's going to render that table. It's going to say, oh, this is an HTML file. And doing this, it will convert that HTML content into the rich text that Cherwell works with. You can only do this in HTML format when you're working with either a pop-up. This one specifically, if you use a pop-up, you have to use format of text box to get rich text content to render, or the only other place that this works, I believe, is if you're using an email. You might be able to insert this directly into a rich text field if you're doing an update business object action, but you can't put this content into a variable. I believe variables will strip out rich text and you'll lose out on all that functionality. But then you'll see in our email, we're just directly pasting that content from file token into our email. And then finally, we can see what this looks like. If we run this one step, I've set it up to also show me a pop-up because I've run into use cases in the past where people have wanted a pop-up with tables of information, for instance, like journals with lists of audit information. This is useful, and you'll notice if you put this into a pop-up like this, it is actually responsive to the screen resolution or to the resolution of the window, which is kind of neat. I think that's a pretty handy trick. But then as well, it's sending out in an email. So my use case for this was that I want once a week to have an email go out telling each team, for instance, second level support, how many open tickets and which tickets are on their team that are open, and those will come through on this email. I believe you can do some other HTML tricks like putting in links, but I believe if you put links in an HTML document and load them into Cherwell, they might break to where you can kind of click on them and nothing happens. I don't remember, I haven't tried that, but that's a note because I think I'd done that in the past and it hadn't worked. I know if you copy and paste an HTML link directly into an email body, it doesn't always render, but that's pretty much it. So to recap, all we're doing for this is we are populating an HTML table inside a variable, and then we are writing it out to a file in plain text format so that all of this markup is preserved and it's not changed in any way. And then we're reading it in using a content from file token, and we're telling it that it's reading in HTML content so that we'll render this table or this document. And that's it. So that is how we get fancy tables as emails within Cherwell. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below.